The millionaire CEO was rushing to work, until he saw 3 crying girls by a crash site, and recognized his own eyes staring back at him. Andrew Hall had always treated mornings like a military operation. Wake at 5:30 sharp, gym by 6 o'clock, showered and dressed by 7 o'clock in one of his perfectly tailored suits. Coffee was always the same, 2 shots of espresso, no sugar, no milk, and his driver knew never to speak unless spoken to. He was the kind of man who measured time not in minutes, but in results. That day was no different. He was heading to the office for an early executive briefing, already rehearsing the key points in his head, phone in one hand, Bluetooth headset in the other, issuing instructions before the sun had fully cleared the skyline. But as the car curved down a quiet road just outside the city center, traffic slowed. His driver glanced in the rearview mirror and said, "Looks like an accident up ahead." Andrew barely acknowledged it. Accidents happened. They were unfortunate, yes, but part of the everyday world he operated above. He had no time for disruptions. That changed when he saw them. Off to the side of the wreck, just beyond the flashing lights and police tape, were 3 small figures. They were sitting on the grass near the edge of the sidewalk, close enough to the wrecked car that the connection was obvious. 3 little girls, no older than 5, dressed in white dresses now streaked with dirt and tears. Their hair was a soft light brown, tangled from wind and stress, their eyes wide and wet. Identical. The car involved in the crash had clearly taken a hard hit, its front was crushed against a pole, the driver's side smashed in. Paramedics were still working, and a stretcher had just been loaded into the ambulance. A woman, unconscious. Someone called out the name Maggie as the doors closed. It hit Andrew like ice down his spine. Maggie. It couldn't be. He opened the car door himself before his driver could react and walked toward the girls. He wasn't sure what drew him closer, concern, instinct, or the strange, immediate pull he felt in his chest, but he knew he had to see them up close. One of the officers tried to wave him off, but Andrew raised his hand, quietly but firmly. "I think I know them," he said, even though he wasn't sure how. The girls looked at him, eyes wide but not fearful. Just, waiting. One of them clutched a small stuffed bunny to her chest. Another had scraped knees and no shoes. The third held tightly to the others, not speaking, just staring. They looked like they had been sitting there for hours, though it had barely been 20 minutes since the crash. He crouched down. "What's your name?" he asked the one with the bunny. "I'm Katie," she said softly, barely above a whisper. "That's Bella and Rose." She pointed to her sisters, who gave small nods. "Are you okay?" he asked. "We're waiting for Mommy," Bella said. "She told us to stay here when the car stopped. But she didn't come back." Andrew swallowed. Something cold and painful twisted in his chest. He looked closer at their eyes, green, exactly like his. Their soft light brown hair. The curve of their mouths. It couldn't be. Except it could. Except it was. He turned to the officer nearby. "The woman. Maggie Thompson. Is that her name?" The officer nodded. "Yeah. Do you know her?" Andrew didn't answer right away. His throat tightened. He hadn't seen Maggie in 6 years. They had parted on strange, unspoken terms, the kind that leave too many questions and too little resolution. She had vanished. No calls, no messages. He had assumed she'd moved on with her life. Clearly, she had. And now he was staring at the pieces of it, 3 little girls who looked like they had walked out of a reflection of his past. "Yeah," he finally said. "I knew her." He sat down on the grass beside the girls, ignoring the way his suit picked up dirt and stains. He didn't call his office. He didn't check the time. He just sat there in silence, watching over 3 small strangers who, somehow, felt like they had always belonged to him. The girls didn't cry anymore. They just sat beside Andrew on the grass, their small bodies close together, as if they knew that the only safety they had left was each other. He kept glancing at them, still trying to make sense of the overwhelming familiarity etched into their faces. The curve of their chins, the way their eyes shifted when they were confused or unsure, it was like watching echoes of himself in miniature form. He didn't know how to process it, so he did the only thing he could do in that moment: he stayed with them. After a while, one of the officers returned to inform him that the mother, Maggie Thompson, was now in the intensive care unit. She was alive, but her condition was unstable. No next of kin had been located. There was no emergency contact. They had found a phone in the wreck, but it was locked and badly damaged. For now, the children would be placed into emergency foster care. Social services had been called and were already on their way. The words barely reached Andrew. It wasn't that he didn't understand what was being said, it was that he couldn't imagine letting them go with strangers when everything in his gut told him he shouldn't. He looked at the girls again. Katie was sitting closest to him, still holding the bunny. Bella had her arms wrapped around her knees. Rose was looking at the ambulance in the distance, her brows furrowed like she was waiting for someone to come back and explain what was going on. Andrew turned to the officer. "I want to take them," he said. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Take them?" "Home," Andrew clarified. "With me. At least until their mother is well. I think they're mine." It was the first time he'd said it out loud. It felt strange, like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. But he didn't take it back. The officer called over the paramedic, who in turn contacted the hospital. Within the hour, a social worker named Leah arrived. She was young, with tired eyes and a firm but kind tone. She sat down with Andrew on the curb, clipboard in hand, and asked him for every piece of information he could remember about Maggie, their relationship, and why he believed the girls were his. He told her the truth, about the relationship that ended too soon, about the silence that followed, about how he had no idea she had been pregnant. He watched Leah as she took notes and nodded in quiet understanding. She didn't challenge him, but she didn't make it easy either. There were protocols, she said. Rules. The children couldn't just leave with someone, even someone who may be their father. Andrew offered to provide DNA immediately, suggested running background checks, referenced attorneys who could vouch for his character. Leah agreed to begin the emergency placement paperwork. If Maggie remained unconscious and no one else came forward, there was a chance the girls could stay with him temporarily. But he had to commit, not just emotionally, but legally. Andrew didn't hesitate. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The girls were taken to the hospital briefly to be checked for injuries, scrapes, bruises, a possible sprain in Bella's ankle, but no serious harm. They were brave, silent through the exams, and only clung to him tighter when it was time to leave. He held their hands, all three at once, unsure how he would fit them into his life but certain now that he had to. That evening, he brought them home. Not to his apartment in the city, but to a smaller, quieter townhouse he kept in the suburbs for weekend escapes. It had 3 bedrooms and a yard. It wasn't designed for children, but it would do for now. He bought them pizza and let them eat on the living room floor. He gave them new toothbrushes, fresh pajamas, and let them choose where to sleep. The girls didn't say much, but they didn't resist either. When it was time for bed, they crawled into one room together and fell asleep in a tangle of limbs, still dressed in those worn white dresses. Andrew stood at the doorway long after the lights were off, watching them breathe, still trying to wrap his head around what had happened in a single day. He sat on the couch alone that night, unable to sleep, his phone on silent beside him. His suit jacket was still dirty from the roadside. His schedule for the next day was full of meetings he had no intention of attending. None of it mattered anymore. He had stepped into something irreversible. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to step back. The next morning was quiet, almost too quiet for a house that now held 3 5-year-old girls. Andrew woke early, his internal clock still tuned to years of boardroom meetings and red-eye flights. He sat on the edge of the guest room bed he had barely slept in, staring at the sunlight beginning to push through the curtains. Everything in the house felt unfamiliar now, even though he had owned it for years. The space had been built for escape, a quiet weekend refuge from his fast-paced life in the city. It was never meant to be a home, and certainly not one filled with toys, coloring books, and small voices. He walked down the hallway to the bedroom where the girls had slept. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, he saw them still curled together on the bed, tangled in blankets, their faces peaceful in the way only children could manage after emotional exhaustion. Katie's arm was draped over Bella. Rose was holding the same stuffed bunny from the day before. They hadn't stirred all night. He didn't wake them. Instead, he went into the kitchen and stared at the empty fridge for a moment before realizing he had no idea what they liked to eat. Everything he owned was prepackaged or imported: protein bars, coffee, wine. Nothing suitable for children. So he drove to the nearest grocery store and wandered the aisles like a stranger, picking out cereal boxes with cartoon characters, fruit snacks, little juice cartons with straws, and ingredients for pancakes even though he hadn't made them since college. He bought crayons, paper, toothbrushes in 3 different colors, and shoes because he remembered one of them had none the day before. When he returned, the girls were awake. They were sitting on the couch in silence, their feet dangling over the edge, watching cartoons with the volume turned low. Katie turned to him when he entered, and there was something cautious in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but a kind of watchfulness, as if waiting to see if he would still be there. "I brought breakfast," he said, holding up the bags like a peace offering. They followed him into the kitchen without a word. He tried to keep it light, talking as he cooked pancakes, explaining what he was doing even though they didn't ask. When he placed 3 plates in front of them with little buttered pancakes and sliced strawberries, Bella whispered thank you so quietly he almost missed it. After breakfast, the girls began to speak more, tentatively at first. They asked where their mother was. Andrew didn't lie, but he softened the truth. "She's still in the hospital. The doctors are taking care of her," he said. "She's trying very hard to get better." They asked if they could visit. He promised he'd find out when that was possible. Later that afternoon, a nurse called to say Maggie was stable but still unconscious. The damage from the crash had been serious, and recovery would take time. There were no guarantees. Andrew stood at the window as he listened, the girls playing quietly behind him on the rug, building towers out of sofa cushions. He thanked the nurse and hung up, then turned to watch them. They were already making space for themselves in his world. In the early evening, a representative from Child Services came to check on the temporary placement. Leah returned, clipboard in hand, and spent the better part of an hour walking through the house, asking the girls questions, watching how they interacted with Andrew. They didn't cling to him, but they didn't resist him either. When Leah asked if they felt safe, Rose looked up and said, "He made us pancakes." It wasn't a glowing endorsement, but it was enough. Andrew answered every question. He provided documents, references, agreed to DNA testing, and scheduled a background check. He explained that he had already spoken to his legal team and wanted to begin the process of obtaining emergency custody. Not because he wanted to take the girls away from their mother, but because he wasn't willing to let them disappear into the system while Maggie recovered. That night, after baths and bedtime stories awkwardly read from books he'd bought that morning, he tucked each of them in. Katie asked if he would stay until they fell asleep. He did. He sat there in the dark room, listening to their breathing slow, the quiet rhythm filling the space like music. And he realized that something inside him had shifted entirely. He wasn't just reacting to the crisis anymore. He was building something new, something he never expected, but suddenly couldn't imagine losing. The 4th day began with rain. Not the soft, calming kind, but the loud, steady downpour that made the windows hum and the sky feel low. Andrew had barely slept. His thoughts had spun through the night, circling the same questions over and over. What happened to Maggie after she left? Why hadn't she told him about the girls? Would she even want him here now, tangled in a life she had built without him? There were no answers yet, only the weight of those 3 children sleeping under his roof and the gnawing ache in his chest each time he looked at them. He walked into the kitchen and found the girls already awake. They were sitting at the table, still in their pajamas, coloring in silence. The crayons were scattered, the paper torn at the edges, but they seemed content. When he greeted them, they each looked up with sleepy, curious eyes and gave him soft smiles. It was so subtle, but it filled him with a kind of warmth that felt foreign and necessary. He made toast and eggs while they continued to draw. He didn't know how to talk to them about what might happen next, but he knew he couldn't avoid it. After breakfast, he sat down across from them and said gently, "I spoke to the hospital again this morning. Your mom is still sleeping, but she's doing a little better." Katie nodded slowly. "Can we see her?" Rose asked. Andrew hesitated, then promised to try and arrange a visit soon. He didn't say that Maggie hadn't opened her eyes once since the accident, or that the doctors still weren't sure when she would. Later that day, he met with Leah again. The emergency custody paperwork had been submitted, but now there were more steps: home visits, interviews, the DNA results, which would take a few more days. She asked if he was certain about continuing. He looked at her and said, "They don't feel like strangers anymore." That was the only answer he had. In the afternoon, he took the girls to a small children's bookstore nearby. It was raining too hard for the park, but he wanted to get them out of the house. They walked through the aisles slowly, picking books with bright covers and silly titles. Emma chose a story about a dragon who couldn't roar. Katie picked one with glitter on every page. Bella held onto a tiny board book shaped like a bunny. The woman at the counter gave them each a free bookmark and told Andrew they had lovely manners. When they got home, he made them grilled cheese sandwiches. They ate on the floor of the living room, curled in a pile of pillows. Andrew tried to read the dragon book out loud, making up voices for each character. The girls giggled when he stumbled, their laughter high and pure. For a few moments, it felt like something whole. That night, as the rain continued outside, the girls huddled together in bed, whispering in the dark. Andrew stood at the door and listened to the sound of their soft voices, and he didn't feel like an intruder anymore. He felt like part of something fragile and new, but growing stronger each day. Before heading to bed himself, he sat down with a legal pad and wrote a letter to Maggie, not to send, not yet, but because he needed to say it somewhere. He wrote that he didn't hate her. That he wished she'd told him. That the girls were safe. That they were brilliant and strange and funny and so heartbreakingly beautiful that it scared him. He wrote that he was trying. That he didn't know what she'd want when she woke up, but that he was here, and he wasn't leaving. Then he folded the paper and tucked it away. He turned off the light, walked back down the hallway, and checked on the girls one more time before sleep. As he stood there, watching them in the stillness, he realized something he hadn't let himself feel until now: hope. Not just that Maggie would wake up, but that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a detour. Maybe this was the beginning of a life he never knew he wanted but couldn't imagine without. The call came early in the morning, just as Andrew was pouring cereal into 3 mismatched bowls and listening to the girls argue, gently, over which cartoon to watch after breakfast. The phone buzzed on the counter, and when he saw the hospital's number, everything in him went still. He stepped out of the kitchen and answered with a low voice, already bracing for the worst. But the nurse's words weren't what he expected. Maggie was awake. Groggy, confused, but conscious. Breathing on her own. Stable enough to allow a short visit. Relief hit him so suddenly it made his knees weak, and for a moment, he simply leaned against the wall in silence, eyes closed. When he returned to the kitchen, the girls were giggling again, one of them with a milk mustache, another trying to balance a spoon on her nose. He didn't want to disrupt the joy in the room, but they deserved to know. "Your mom is awake," he said softly, and 3 sets of brown eyes turned to him instantly, the room falling silent. "She's still very tired and can't have a lot of visitors yet, but she asked for you." The silence broke with a collective breath. Katie covered her mouth like she might cry. Rose whispered, "I knew she would wake up." The hospital arranged a private visit in the late morning. Andrew brought flowers, nothing elaborate, just soft, cheerful daisies, and helped the girls choose small drawings they wanted to give their mom. He had dressed them in clean outfits, brushed their hair as best he could, and told them it was okay if they didn't know what to say right away. Walking into the hospital felt different this time. He wasn't just the man visiting a patient. He was bringing her daughters home to her, and the weight of that settled deep in his chest. The nurses smiled as they entered, stepping aside to let the girls through first. Maggie was propped up in the hospital bed, pale and worn but unmistakably alive. The moment she saw them, her eyes filled with tears. The girls rushed forward in unison, climbing gently onto the bed, arms around her shoulders, their little voices overlapping. "We missed you, are you okay?" "We were good, we promise." Andrew stood back and let them have that moment. Maggie held all 3 of them, eyes squeezed shut, her fingers trembling as they brushed through their hair. When the initial emotion settled, she looked up and saw Andrew. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then she said quietly, "You came." He stepped closer. "I didn't know," he said, and his voice cracked. "Not until I saw them." Maggie nodded, her eyes full of something complicated, guilt, gratitude, regret. "I was scared," she admitted. "You had your whole life planned. I didn't want to break it." He sat in the chair beside the bed. "You didn't break anything," he said. "They changed it. And I'm glad they did." The girls drifted to sleep beside their mother after a while, the day's emotions finally catching up with them. Andrew stayed as long as he could, talking with Maggie about everything they had missed, 6 years of silence, and now suddenly, nothing was hidden. She told him about the pregnancy, about being alone, about why she chose to disappear. He listened, not interrupting, not judging. Just being there. Before he left, she reached out and took his hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice faint. "For them. For not walking away." He squeezed her hand in return. "I'm not going anywhere." When he got home that night, the house felt different. Not just fuller, but grounded in something real. The girls were asleep before dinner, still emotionally spent, and Andrew sat alone in the living room, the hospital bracelet Maggie had been wearing now resting quietly on the coffee table. It was a strange symbol, of pain, yes, but also of survival, of connection, of the life that had somehow brought them all back together. He looked around the room, at the books scattered across the floor, the crayons on the table, the small shoes by the door. This wasn't the life he had imagined for himself, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel the ache of something missing. He felt present. Needed. Rooted. And when he finally went to bed, he left the door open just a crack, not for himself, but in case any one of the girls woke up and needed to know he was still there. The transition from hospital to home was slower than expected, filled with fragile moments and careful steps. Maggie was released a week after waking, her movement still weak, her breathing shallow on some days, but her determination clear. Andrew drove her home in silence, the girls holding onto her from the back seat, quiet but smiling, as if their very presence was helping to hold her together. The house looked different to her. It was the same suburban rental with neutral colors and too many clean surfaces, but it now held signs of life, tiny socks left on the stairs, sticky notes with bedtime reminders, a magnet spelling game covering the fridge. Her daughters had been living here, and so had he. Andrew had prepared a room for her on the ground floor, arranging it so she wouldn't have to climb stairs while she recovered. He bought extra pillows, a soft blanket, and even a little lamp with a warm yellow glow, different from the sterile light of the hospital. Maggie hadn't asked for any of this, but when she stepped inside, her eyes welled up. She didn't say anything at first, just sat on the edge of the bed and touched the edge of the blanket. Andrew waited, leaning against the doorway, letting her process it all without interruption. The girls adapted quickly. They no longer hovered or asked if she would wake up again. Instead, they brought her books, whispered secrets in her ear, and crawled into her lap any chance they got. There were a few moments when Maggie had to look away, overwhelmed by their closeness and how much she had almost lost. But Andrew never pushed her. He noticed every time she froze, every time she needed space, and stepped in quietly with a joke, a snack, or a reason to let her breathe without guilt. The rhythm of the house began to shift. Meals were shared at the table. The television was mostly background noise. Afternoons were filled with puzzles and crafts, while evenings became the sacred time for stories, some read by Maggie in a soft voice, others improvised by Andrew in increasingly dramatic fashion, much to the girls' delight. He had learned how to braid hair unevenly, how to untangle necklace knots, how to be the jungle Jim, the referee, and the calm voice after a bad dream. None of it was easy, but it felt natural now, like a life he had somehow always been preparing for. One evening, while the girls were playing in the backyard and the sun was beginning to lower over the trees, Maggie stepped outside with 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Andrew and sat next to him on the porch steps. They watched the girls chase each other through the grass, laughing and calling out imaginary rules to a game they seemed to invent as they went. For a while, neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel heavy. It was shared. Eventually, Maggie looked over at him and asked, "Why didn't you get angry?" Andrew took a long sip before answering. "I was," he said. "But not at you. At myself, mostly. For not looking harder. For not knowing." He paused, then added, "But then I met them, and all of that stopped mattering." Maggie nodded slowly. "I thought I was protecting them. And you. But I think I was just afraid of what you'd do if you knew." He didn't argue. He simply said, "I'm here now." She smiled, tired but genuine. "I know. I see it every day." That night, after the girls had gone to bed and the house was still again, Maggie brought out a folder filled with medical bills, old school forms, hand-drawn family trees with only one parent listed. She placed them on the table between them and said, "If we're going to do this right, we should do it together." Andrew reached across the table and slid the folder toward him. "We already are," he said. There was no formality in the moment, no grand declarations. Just 2 people trying their best for the 3 lives they had created, separated by time but not by love. He didn't know what the next step was supposed to be. He didn't know if they'd ever fall back in love, or if the word family would always feel like something stitched together from broken parts. But what he did know was that it was real. It was messy and imperfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time, that was enough. By the time summer deepened, the household had settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. The chaos no longer felt like something to tame, but something to live inside of, something that gave shape to their days. Andrew had adjusted to early mornings with cereal and spilled milk, to lost shoes before leaving the house, to being interrupted mid-email by little voices asking for help with buttons, stories, or glue. The quiet, hyper-controlled life he once led seemed like someone else's story now, a distant echo of who he thought he had to be. This version of his life, with Maggie upstairs humming softly as she painted in the mornings, with laughter bouncing off walls that used to echo in silence, wasn't what he'd imagined, but it was better in every way that mattered. He'd started working again, but part-time and entirely remote, turning one of the spare rooms into a home office that he often shared with Rose, who insisted she could be his assistant if she had her own notebook and a cup of apple juice. Most of his days ended with playtime outside, followed by dinner as a group. Maggie had started cooking again when she had the energy, and Andrew learned how to make a decent pasta dish and finally figured out the oven timer. The girls had made a habit of rating every meal on imaginary scorecards, often giving him a 10 out of 10 just for trying. It became a game that softened the edges of even the hardest days. Maggie had also begun to heal emotionally, slowly rebuilding her confidence and sense of direction. She picked up freelance illustration jobs again, sometimes working late into the night at the kitchen table surrounded by coffee mugs and colored pencils. Andrew would watch her from the doorway, quietly admiring the way she found her place again. They didn't talk much about the past anymore. It wasn't out of avoidance, but because they were too focused on the present. Trust was forming, not easily, but deliberately, with every shared meal, every whispered conversation after the girls had gone to bed, every decision made together without drama. One Sunday, the girls organized a family fair in the backyard. They made tickets from construction paper, created games using old laundry baskets and plastic rings, and convinced Maggie to paint faces while Andrew manned the lemonade stand. The event was chaotic and adorable, with Maggie laughing so hard she nearly spilled paint down her dress and Andrew getting pelted by water balloons he didn't know were part of the rules. At the end of the afternoon, the girls insisted on a group photo, and when Andrew looked at the picture later, all he could see was the strange, beautiful completeness of it. 3 joyful faces framed by grass and sun, 2 adults kneeling beside them with expressions neither forced nor posed, just honest and whole. That night, after the girls fell asleep in a pile of blankets on the living room floor, exhausted from their own event, Andrew and Maggie sat quietly on the back steps. The yard was still dotted with paper tickets and half-deflated balloons. The stars were beginning to show. Maggie leaned against his shoulder, and he didn't move, just stayed still and let the quiet settle between them like an old song. "They're happy," she said eventually, her voice quiet. "You make them feel safe." He took a breath and said, "So do you." She shifted slightly, looked up at him. "Do you ever wish you'd known sooner?" He thought about that for a moment. "Of course," he said. "But maybe I wouldn't have been ready then. I think I am now." She nodded, then took his hand. There was no urgency, no label for what they were becoming again. It wasn't about recreating the past. It was about choosing this version of now, and maybe, one day, a future that none of them had dared to plan before. Inside the house, the sound of soft breathing and the occasional turn in sleep filled the quiet. Outside, the night wrapped itself around the porch like a promise. And in the middle of it all, Andrew understood something simple and profound: this wasn't a second chance, it was their first real one. The final weeks of summer passed like a warm breeze, slow and golden and filled with quiet changes that almost went unnoticed until they became part of everyday life. Andrew found himself waking before the alarm, not out of obligation but anticipation. The mornings had become his favorite time, before the world stirred, when the house was dim and calm, when he could sip coffee and listen to the faint sounds of sleep from the girls' rooms. There was peace in that silence, not the hollow kind he used to crave in his old life, but the kind that made space for meaning. He no longer felt like he was holding his breath. He was breathing fully, for the first time in years. School was starting soon, and the house buzzed with excitement and anxiety. Maggie took the girls shopping for backpacks and supplies, each of them choosing something with a spark of personality. Katie picked rainbows, Bella wanted stars, and Rose insisted on dinosaurs even though her sisters teased her for it. Andrew let them take the lead, watching them fill the cart with notebooks and markers and snacks. He didn't try to control anything. He didn't need to. They trusted him now. That was new. Maggie had grown stronger, both physically and emotionally. She moved with more confidence, stood taller when she entered a room. There were still moments of hesitation, of fatigue, but she allowed Andrew to help without resentment. Their partnership had deepened into something neither of them had words for yet. It was more than co-parenting, not quite a return to what they once were, but something steady and genuine and full of quiet hope. They moved around each other easily, passing mugs, folding clothes, sharing looks that didn't need explanation. The past no longer hovered like a shadow. It had become a foundation. One evening, they all sat together on the front porch, watching the sky turn pink and gold. The girls were sprawled on a blanket, drawing pictures of their new family, as they called it now. Maggie's hand rested loosely in Andrew's. He didn't remember when they started holding hands again. It had happened without discussion, without ceremony. One day it just felt right, and so it stayed. Do you remember the day you saw them on the side of the road? Maggie asked softly, her voice drifting between them. Every detail, he replied. I used to wonder if I'd done the right thing, keeping it all to myself. But then I see them now, and I think, maybe this was how it had to happen. Andrew nodded. He wasn't angry anymore. Not at her. Not at the time they'd lost. Everything that had gone wrong had led them here, and here was worth everything. The girls finished their drawings and brought them over, each one a chaotic masterpiece of stick figures, hearts, stars, and their names written in shaky, uneven letters. In every picture, there were 5 of them. Always 5. That night, as Andrew tucked them into bed, one by one, with different blankets and different requests for songs or stories, he felt a fullness he couldn't describe. He stood in the hallway afterward, staring at the closed doors and listening to the muffled sound of Maggie in the kitchen cleaning up dinner. This house, once just a place, was now a life. A real one. One that asked for his presence instead of his performance. One that gave him more in a single laugh or a sleepy hug than any boardroom ever had. He joined Maggie on the couch. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. She leaned into him and he wrapped an arm around her, both of them watching the soft flicker of the porch light and listening to the hush of the world outside. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something earned. A life chosen not because it was easy, but because it was right. A story that didn't need to be perfect to be beautiful. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, Andrew understood with complete certainty, this was home. Not the building, not the location, these people. This love. This second chance at everything that mattered. What makes the ending of this story so powerful is its quiet transformation, not just in Andrew's life, but in how he views love, responsibility, and identity. It's not a fairy tale resolution, where everything is wrapped up neatly, but something much more meaningful, a man who built his world around control learning to live in uncertainty, and choosing love anyway. The journey is emotional without being overly dramatic, rooted in everyday moments, packing school lunches, bedtime stories, shared silences, that slowly rewrite his definition of success. I think what resonates most is how the story doesn't erase the past or magically fix the pain. Instead, it embraces the complexity of second chances. Andrew and Maggie don't return to who they were, they become something better, built not on regret but on resilience. The girls, unknowingly, become the center of that change, not because they needed saving, but because they gave their father a reason to show up differently. For me, the ending isn't about a perfect family, it's about a real one. It's about choosing presence over perfection. And that choice, made quietly day after day, is what makes the story not just heartwarming, but unforgettable.